the whole topic of sustainable transport and livability. And we have our wonderful speaker today, Professor Aruna Sivakumar from Imperial College London. Before she begins her presentation, I'll just run through a small introduction to this webinar series, as well as introduction to the organizers, just for initial 5-7 minutes, and then we will have Professor Aruna begin with her presentation. Let me share my screen and just put my introductory slides on the. Hopefully my screen is visible. Himantini, can you confirm?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So so our today's speaker is Professor Aruna Sivakumar, and her topic for presentation today is accessibility metrics in urban and transport planning, going beyond travel times and cost. This is jointly organized by the Special Interest Group of the World Conference on Transport Research Society on Livability and Sustainable Transport. It's called SIGF4, together with the journal Sustainable Transport and Livability, which is published by Taylor and Francis and was launched recently last year on 7th of November in association with my research lab at Indian Institute of Science. I'll quickly run through a brief about the webinar series. The purpose is to foster knowledge exchange and propel the discourse on topics related to sustainable transport and livability. And as I mentioned, this is jointly organized by the WCTRS Special Interest Group and the journal Sustainable Transport and Livability in association with IISc Lab. We intend to do one webinar approximately once every 2 months as part of this webinar series. So you are going to see a lot more esteemed speakers speaking in this forum going forward. And the potential speakers would include the eminent researchers, as we have today, through invitation. And we'd also have selected authors of the papers published in this journal, Sustainable Transport and Livability, who would also be invited to speak at this webinar series. In India and UK, cricket is quite a popular sport. So in a cricketing terms, Professor Aruna is our opening batsman. And we are very thankful to Professor Aruna for taking up this challenge and being part of this webinar series as the opening speaker, or in what I say, opening batsman. A brief about the WCTRS Special Interest Group F4 on livability and sustainable transport. It basically is focusing on research that furthers our knowledge on many linkages between sustainable transport and livability. And these linkages could include impacts on quality of life, equity, social justice, safety, accessibility, affordability, environment quality, and so on and so forth, different aspects of well-being, and so on. And the SIG, particularly encourages research that are cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary. The current chair of the SIG is myself from IISc Bangalore. And also the co-chair of this special interest group is Professor Kazuki Nakamura from Mijo University in Japan. We currently have 26 members as part of the special interest group. As you can see this list here, I'm not going to read out the details who are driving this special interest group. Talking about this journal, Sustainable Transport and Livability, which was launched on 7th November 2023. It's a fully open access journal that focuses on these linkages, as I had mentioned. This is the esteemed editorial board of this journal. We have, very renowned and known colleagues in this whole area of transport and livability from all across the world as part of the editorial board. And so wonderful team in place here for this journal. This is the aims and scope of the journal. It's similar to what I explained earlier. The important thing is, while it's fully open access journal, currently there is an ongoing full APC waiver for authors who are willing to publish in this new journal, as offered by the publisher Taylor & Francis. Yeah, to introduce our today's speaker, Professor Aruna Sivakumar. She is a reader in the Center for Transport Engineering and Modeling at Imperial College London in UK, and also director of the Urban Systems Lab. She leads and has led several smart city and systems modeling initiatives funded by PSRC, ESRC, EU Horizon 2020, Shell Inc. in the UK, etc. Aruna has over 20 years of experience in travel demand modeling research in the UK, Europe, and the US, with expertise in activity-based travel demand modeling, the microeconomic modeling of travel behavior and demand, accessibility and equity analysis, transport planning and policy, and also in terms of application areas, it includes a transport mode and destination choice, shared mobility and micromobility services, health and equity implications of travel behavior, electric vehicle adoption, charging, and use patterns for private and fleet vehicles, and the impact of social influence on choice in travel behavior. Aruna is a member of several scientific committees, including the Travel Forecasting Committee of TRB in the US. And of course, he is a member of the Special Interest Group, as well as one of the editorial boards of this new journal, TSTL. So with this brief introduction, I invite our speaker, Professor Aruna, to begin her presentation. For the participants, please note that there is a Q&A button on the top that you can see. As the presentation moves forward, you can please type in your questions here, and we'll take these questions for answer by the speaker at the end of our presentation. In case of any other comment or query, please use the chat button that is next to the Q&A button. Yeah, with this, I hand over to Professor Aruna.
Thank you, Ashish. That was not a brief introduction. That was quite a long introduction, so I won't say anything more about myself now. I'll jump right into the presentation. I'll try to not take as long as 45 minutes, but it's about 25 to 30 slides, so it shouldn't take too long. So the topic I've taken on today is one of revisiting accessibility metrics for urban and transport planning, and in particular going beyond travel times and costs in developing these metrics. This is part of a working paper. I completely, without my co-authors, none of the work that I'm going to be presenting today would have been possible. So there's an actual paper associated with this, which hopefully you will all see published soon. So there'll be more details in there, but I'll try to give you an insight into what motivated this and what we've produced from the process. So today's presentation, I'm going to talk briefly about what is accessibility. And if all of you are reasonably comfortable in the transport planning domain, you probably also already know the answer to this, but I want to make sure that there's no confusion about what I'm talking about when I say accessibility. And I'll provide a brief overview, a very brief overview of accessibility research. There's plenty of review papers in the space of accessibility that can give you a lot more insight. So this is just meant, again, to position the work more than anything else. Then I'll talk about how we thought about expanding the scope of accessibility and what we did in that process. I will present an empirical case study with London as the case study. And then finally, a summary of some concluding thoughts. As you can see in this slide already, accessibility actually has a wide range of meanings and implications. For some part of the transport community, when they hear the word accessibility, it's disability access. And what they're looking at is urban design, how to provide ramps, how to make sure that people with different kinds of disabilities still have access to the transport system. That is accessibility in that world. Then there's local access. How far is the nearest bus stop or the tube station? Do you have footpaths that can take you to the nearest shopping centers? These are local access, what's near the home almost. And very often local access focuses on the transport infrastructure. In other words, do homes have access to bus routes, metro routes, cycling routes, and so on? That's local access. And that sort of falls somewhere in between the disability access, and the more regional access to opportunities. It's the third of these that I'm talking about today. So regional access to opportunities or spatial access. Some people call it spatial access, some people call it regional access. For some reason, there isn't a single paper that tries to clarify these terms. Maybe an exception is, I'm just checking, Ashish, am I still connected?
Yeah, all good,
Okay.
all good.
Okay, I heard something drop and I wanted to make sure. Let me know if, send me a message if it drops by any chance. It shouldn't
Yeah,
happen, but
sure.
send me a message. Okay,
It's going great.
so
Thank you.
there is a very interesting paper by Susan Handy actually a few years ago, who actually addresses this question of what is accessibility, what is regional accessibility, what is spatial accessibility, how wide is regional accessibility, how narrow is it, and so on. Apart from that one paper, I actually haven't seen too many people address the question of clarifying these terms. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'd like to make very clear that we're focusing on the regional access to opportunities, with local access being part of that picture, which falls somewhere in between the other two topics that I've presented here. So in my world, in the world of this paper, what is accessibility? It is the definition that is used in urban planning. In other words, the ease with which activities at one place can be reached from another place through the transport network. And this includes work or jobs, includes a variety of non-work, shopping, social, recreational activities, and so on. And as a result, this definition of accessibility is a function of the spatial distribution of the destinations, which are the activity centers or the center of opportunity, relative to the given location, which is usually the home location. It is also a function of the magnitude and quality and character of activities found at the destination. In other words, if we're looking at accessibility to jobs, then this accessibility is a function of the spatial distribution of the destination zones where the jobs are, the number of jobs there are in different occupation types, and maybe also the income levels, the kind of skill sets required, if we could afford to have that kind of information, maybe even how good an employer they are, but we don't go that far. Then there's also the efficiency of the transport system. In other words, how easy is it to get from your home location to these centers of opportunities, that is the destinations. What is the travel time? What is the travel cost? And very rarely, as I will point out shortly, do we talk about how convenient is it to travel. We talk about time and cost as being the main drivers of this efficiency of the transport system. And then there's the characteristics of the traveler, of course. Some accessibility metrics take this into consideration, some don't. In other words, the age or gender or income level and so on. Very typically, the more disaggregate accessibility measures do, and the aggregate ones don't. Again, there's a number of papers that talk about this definition of accessibility and how to measure it. There's mention of distance-based measures, there's mention of gravity-based measures, infrastructure, location, person, and utility-based measures. Like I said, there's review papers that are really good for this. The Gers and Van Wie 2013 paper, if you look for accessibility measures, or an earlier paper from 2004 of Gers and Van Wie are excellent papers to look at. I also have a reference in the previous slide, that's Sten Hansen's 2009 paper. But I want to pause on this slide about the measures of accessibility for just a few, for a minute maybe, before we go into my work, which is that broadly, the simplest form of measuring accessibility is a distance-based measure. In other words, what destinations can you access within 15 minutes? Very often the concept of 15-minute city in some way is linked to these measures of accessibility, right? Then there's the gravity-based measure, which takes into account a combination of distance as well as the attractiveness of competing destinations, and it uses a gravity type formulation for those who are familiar with trip generation distribution models and the gravity-based approach. Now, the work that we're presenting to you today is primarily focused on this gravity-based approach, where we take into account the opportunities at the destination and a measure of impedance in getting to that destination, but we want to enhance both of those, as I will describe very shortly. I also wanted to briefly mention that there is this sort of hierarchy in the literature of infrastructure-based accessibility, which in some ways is the most aggregate form, location-based accessibility, which is sort of zonal accessibility, PTALs, for those of you who know about accessibility, the public transport accessibility levels that was developed in London many decades ago, is part infrastructure, part location-based. Then there's person-based accessibility. And as you go down the scale, it starts to get more and more disaggregate with more and more data that can be used. And correspondingly, perhaps a little less applied. However, in the last 10 to 20 years, there's been a huge number of papers focused on the bottom end of this scale, so more disaggregate and detailed accessibility measures. Now, in most of these accessibility measures, there are several factors that are considered. Travel time and cost, which is sort of the top two on my list here, are probably the most widely used factors in determining locational accessibility. And there are most accessibility measures include travel time and cost. There are a few that talk about the quality of the destination, which is basically the how good the quality is. So if I take the example of education, which is the example I'm going to take for the London case study, are these good schools we have access to? And how do we determine whether these are good schools is another question. Whether there's data for that is another question. But having accessibility to a lot of opportunity without having good quality of opportunity, arguably, is not as valuable. And so taking quality of destination into account is something that is discussed in the literature. There is some use of it in the literature, not very widely done. Nevertheless, it is the literature is aware of it. Let me put it that way. Emissions, on the other hand, to what extent does exposure to pollution feature in accessibility measures? In our measure of accessibility, we do consider it, and there's a point, there's sort of an exploratory analysis that I'm presenting, but overall, these, although they're acknowledged to be an important factor, and some of the papers that are mentioned here talk about the importance of exposure to emissions. However, the role of this factor in accessibility measures is far less common. And as you go down this list, as you talk about the direct impact of crime or apprehension of crime, predictability of journey times, and so on, these are less and less commonly represented in measures of accessibility in the literature. Now, this brings me to what it is that my co-authors and I have been trying to do, which is to expand the scope of the accessibility measurement and to test whether there's value in expanding the scope. Now, travel times and costs, as I've already mentioned, are the most commonly considered measures of travel impedance when you're measuring accessibility. The aim of urban and transport planning, however, is to ensure that all parts of a city or region, or all people to be more precise, you don't have to provide access to regions where nobody lives. So it's more about all parts of the city or region where people live have good accessibility to jobs, education, healthcare, etc. So if we consider measures of travel impedance in getting to these activity opportunities, surely we should look at the quality of those activity opportunities as well. What kind of jobs and schools does the population have access to? And how can we incorporate this quality into the accessibility measure? Yet another question that we basically raised was, what about the quality of the transport service that is used in accessing the activity opportunity? In other words, what about the quality of the journey? Is it okay that people are accessing good schools but are having to walk on roads that are pollution filled if there was an alternative that was more pollution free? In other words, is it a healthy journey in terms of exposure to pollution? Is it a safe journey in terms of exposure to accident risk or crime? And while we look at some of these exposures from an equity analysis perspective, why should we not take these into account in measuring accessibility so that the planning process can more suitably or appropriately take health and well-being into consideration at the planning stage? So these were the questions that we raised for ourselves. And the motivation for this, even apart from isn't it obvious, is that as we enter a new era almost, we've entered it a long time ago in some ways, of focusing not just on economic growth, but also on well-being and health for all, more importantly, it is important to revisit and modify the metrics that we use for planning. Are we using the right metrics? Perhaps we're not even using the metrics as well as we could, which is a different question, not one I'm going to try to answer today. But in the process of designing sustainable transport policies and planning for sustainable transport policies, we argue in this paper that it's important to ensure we have the right metrics that can measure not just impedance and access, but a measure of the livability impacts of this access. And so that brings me to our enhanced accessibility metric. And this accessibility metric has, broadly speaking, 3 axes. On the one hand is the opportunity, and we measure the quality of the opportunity in terms of rating of schools, capacity of schools. I haven't mentioned this already, so it's a bit premature perhaps, but the case study I'm going to present to you is a case study in London of the access to educational opportunities, so primary, secondary schools. So the opportunity quality here consists of the rating of these schools as provided by government organizations like Ofsted, the capacity of these schools, their opening hours, etc. And another axis, we have transport mode, which is the mode of access to the school locations, public transport, walk and bike, private vehicle. And a third axis would be the transport quality. The transport mode axis is your traditional times and costs. And the third axis is the transport quality or the journey quality. This would be the road types, how busy they are, what's the exposure to pollution on these roads, what's the exposure to crime, accident risk, and so on. So in the measure that we are basically considering, we consider travel time, financial cost of travel, the quality of the service, that is the educational institution, as well as the journey quality in terms of the road types that you have to use to get to the destination, the exposure to pollutants, and the exposure to crime. So in this sense, we've expanded what we're calling the basic accessibility measure to use factors that are not traditionally considered. And our aim was to explore what would happen if we expanded this. So it's an exploratory analysis in that sense. So coming to the London case study, it's about measuring accessibility to education, sorry. And there's a lot of analysis that was undertaken, not all of which I'm presenting here today. The reason there was a lot of analysis is because it was exploratory, so you have to do a lot before you get somewhere. We have data from the London Travel Demand Survey of household types by income level, by ethnicity, by borough. So location is at the level of borough. And for those who don't know much about London, there's about 32, if I remember right, boroughs across Greater London. And then you have transport-related considerations of road safety, road types, pollution along routes, crime along routes. We also took some data into consideration of the presence of betting shops and greenery along routes, potentially as an indication of positive and negative perceptions of safety or the journey experience. I don't think we actually put this data into the analysis that I'm going to present today, but there's a lot more that we could be doing with this data. And then we look at radial distances of a quarter kilometer, of a half kilometer, and so on from an educational institution. A little bit of background I need to give you here before I jump into the analysis is that, and this is not true for all cities, so it may or may not be true where you're from. In London, there's a state school system and there's an independent school system. Independent schools are your paid schools and state schools are free education for all effectively. But the state school system requires you to live within the catchment area of the state school. So what that catchment area is not fixed. It's a function of the size of the school, the density of the population around the school, the demographics of the population around the school, and so on. But there is that catchment area and you have to live within that in order to access that school, right? Which slightly complicates our analysis, but we used distances of a quarter kilometer, half kilometer, and so on as radial distances to define whether a household location would be considered to be within the school. And here we're looking at a sample of households from the London Travel Demand Survey. And then once we've done that, we've identified the potential population of households that could use the school. And then we analyze and we do this for each school, of course, and then we analyze the accessibility metrics from the household location to all of those schools, obviously only considering the schools for which the household falls within the catchment area. So it's sort of a two-step process in that sense. The travel times are typically considered are 5, 10, 15 minutes of walking time or 5, 15 minutes of driving time. Though the presentation today, I think I'm presenting walking distance because for state schools in Greater London, most people access it by walk. And so it was a good place to start in order to study the impacts of these additional factors, such as exposure to pollution and crime. So this is the transport-related consideration. And then there's, of course, education-related facilities, state primary and secondary schools, all through schools. We also have data of independent schools, but if I recall correctly, that's not what we're presenting in this analysis at the moment, because that complicates the picture a bit. We calculate, as I said, number of facilities, number of what are qualified as good facilities or outstanding facilities. And these are as per an organization called the Ofsted, which effectively audits and examines. Yep.
Yeah, Aruna, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Did I drop off?
I think there's a little bandwidth issue. Maybe for now you can just switch off your camera for a while so that we'll have your audio clear.
Will do, will do.
And then please continue.
Okay, are you able to switch it off for me?
Okay.
Because it doesn't seem to. Okay, I think that worked.
Oh.
All right.
Yeah,
Continue?
go on, please. Go on.
All right.
Go on.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we have these categorization of school facilities as good, outstanding, and average. I think I don't remember what the low or poor, good, and outstanding. Right, and these are Ofsted classifications data that we've downloaded. And then we calculate, as I said, nearest facility, nearest good facility, nearest outstanding facility, and so on. So these are the top type of calculations that we've been doing. A number of data sources were pooled to achieve this. We have TfL's journey planner for travel times from origin to destination points by various public transport networks. We have emissions data from the London Atmospheric Emissions Inventory. We focus primarily on PM 2.5 and NOx concentrations. And then we look at individual inhaled doses for public transport as well separately, which is another data set from a paper specifically. We looked at recorded crime numbers between March 2018 and February 2019, which we got from the Metropolitan and City of London Police at an LSOA level. As I mentioned already, we have the London Travel Demand Survey, Transport Demand Survey, and then we have London Road Network and OpenStreetMaps and the Ofsted ratings for schools from the Department for Education. So these are the different data sources. We have a GIS platform in which these are pulled together. As I mentioned already, we look at linear distance from the primary school to the household. And we determine whether a household would fall within the catchment area of the school. And for example, I have here right in the middle of that circle, the star is a primary school. It's just an example here. According to Ofsted ratings, it requires improvement, which is not a good sign, basically. It is a primary school, ages 3 to 11, and we determine what are the households that fall within the catchment area of this school. The distribution you see on the right is the distribution of households by income that fall within the catchment area, given a radius of 1 kilometer, 1.5 kilometers, and 2 kilometers. As you can see, it's predominantly lower income. That's partly a function of where the school is located, partly a function of the fact that state schools are more commonly attended by lower income households, a number of different factors there. So there's not, you can't read too much meaning into that is at this point. I think I can jump through this, but just look at the right-hand side of this of the slide in particular. When we measure accessibility using transport network distance, we're looking at average walking and cycling time using sidewalks to the nearest school, outstanding or good school. And so we use things like the presence of sidewalk, the maximum speed, the road types, whether it's a minor road or a major road, an arterial or otherwise effectively, because that tells us how walkable it is, and so on. And then using the transport network distance. So for example, if you take a 5-minute walking distance, you can measure how many schools there are per sampled household in a zone, for example. And this helps us move from a household level metric. So all of what I'm doing now is giving you an idea of the kind of analysis we could do once we've got all of this data into our system. So initially I said we could measure the number of schools that a household could access, but you could actually go from there to measuring at a zonal level the number of schools each household can access, for instance, and so on. And this would be averaged across the sampled households in that zone, for instance. So here in this example, what I'm presenting in the graph that is here, you see within a 5-minute walking distance, the number of state primary schools per sampled household by income. So the blue line is low income, red line is middle income, and the gray line is high income. And you see overall, within a 5-minute, this is for Kingston upon Thames, which is a very different borough from the previous state school that I showed you. So there's a lot of borough by borough differences, as you can expect. There are richer boroughs and not so rich boroughs, and accordingly, these numbers will vary quite a bit. So again, you can't read too much from these metrics at this point. This is just to give you an indication of the kind of metrics we can produce once we've got that data ready in our GIS platform. Now, this is where I want to start comparing, because now we're looking across all boroughs and starting to look at comparative measures. So here I'm presenting to you an accessibility measure for education. I haven't so far told you what that accessibility measure looks like, and I will after we've looked at the numbers. The accessibility measures for education in a step-by-step manner. So on the left-hand side, you see within a 15-minute walking distance, using all available roads, so travel times and costs, any road is allowed. You want to know how many schools are accessible and the number of households that can access 0, 1, 2 schools, etc. So it's a distribution of school accessibility for the households, right? And you see that the median is somewhere around, so the mode is somewhere around 3 thereabouts. So it's reasonably well distributed. The number of outstanding and good schools, if you start to restrict the quality of the schools you're looking at, there's a very slight shift to the left. There are fewer schools, so 2 becomes more common as the number of schools that are accessible to a larger number of households. So there's a slight shift to the left, but broadly not too much of a change. Now, shift from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. The top graph on your right-hand side is again the number of outstanding and good schools now within 15-minute walking distance, but using only minor roads, assuming that there is a greater perception of safety for children walking on minor roads, which means that in the long run, they could actually walk on their own, not something they do at the moment in primary school. However, it makes the perception of safety much higher. So using that as a measure of the perception of safety, if we exclude the major arterials and use only minor roads, then within a 15-minute walking distance, the number of schools naturally drops. The number of households that can access 1 or more schools naturally drops. There's almost 10,000 households in the sample that don't have access to any schools within a 15-minute walking distance, if you look at it that way. Now, if you add to that, going down the list of graphs on the right-hand side, if you add to that and say now you want to exclude major roads, but also exclude excessive exposure to particulate matter and NOx, and then see whether how many schools are accessible to these households, you have a further shifting of that graph to the left. Add crime and avoid exposure to excessive crime, there's an even further shift. However, what you can't see very clearly here is the shift going from step 2 to 3 is a lot more marginal than the shift going from step 1 to 2. So the air quality exposure does a lot more damage in terms of what is available and accessible than crime exposure. This, if you think about it, it's fairly intuitive, not surprising, but the numbers back that up as well. And then if we look at analysis of accessibility by income, on the left-hand side, now we're focusing only on access to outstanding and good schools in this presentation. On the left-hand side, you have distributions by income group. And again, you see the distributions by income group actually don't look too bad overall. The distributions are reasonably similar. You can find some small differences here and there, but broadly the same. But as you shift and take into consideration the quality of the journey or the quality of the road, which is clearly bringing down accessibility, you see the slightly bigger differences by income, with the low-income households being far more affected. So the percentage of households that have access to 0-1 schools, actually it's low and middle to some extent. It's mud. If you look at these numbers, you see it's all ballpark of 20%, and you can't quite see the difference I'm talking about. I'll show you another graph which shows exactly the degree of that difference, but there is a little bit of a difference by income. Now, this, remember, is an average across boroughs. Now, if you focus on specific boroughs, these differences start to become more stark. And interestingly, something that I recall, it sort of stuck in my mind because it's interesting and intuitive, but we don't think about it. But lower income households in higher income zones suffer more from differences of this nature than lower income households in lower income zones. If you take into consideration air quality in particular, this is very true. And again, if you think about it, the reason is obvious. Higher income zones have a lot more car usage, and therefore air quality in many cases is worse. And therefore, the lower income households there who use longer routes, perhaps, more walk and bike, perhaps, etc., they are affected more by not being able to, if they're not able to use the polluted roads effectively. So that's an interesting finding. Now, to clearly show you those numbers a little more, because you couldn't quite see that there, here we have a metric of the median number of schools that can be accessed, and another one, which is the percentage of households with no access to schools within a 15-minute walk. As you can see, when there are no restrictions, that median is about 4, and the percentage of households with no access is about 3.5%. When you add the school quality, the number of schools drops, the percentage of households with no access increases very slightly. When you exclude major roads, which is safety perception, busy roads, traffic, accident risk, etc., there's a huge jump, as you can see, in that accessibility measure. And then again, when you add or remove roads from the perspective of air quality, that gets much worse. The additional impact of crime, as you can see, is relatively small, or exposure to crime is relatively small. Now, for those of you who are wondering where all these numbers came from, this is a summary of the simple, relatively simple accessibility measure that we used, because the aim was to test what happens. Does this data really matter? And so we use an accessibility measure where we have a weighting, and then we have a quality value for each of these school locations, and then we have an impedance, and the impedance has a parameter which is calibrated from a simple distance decay function. Now, the interesting thing is the impedance itself, rather than let that impedance be purely a function of travel time, as you can see on the right-hand side, top right side, it's also a function of cost, of course, but also exposure to pollution, in other words, PM 2.5, NOx, and crime. And we have, from the perspective of travel cost, just a value of time to scale it to time units. But from the perspective of exposure to pollution, we actually look at the daily exposure to pollution levels and then translate that to life years. And using value of life years, we're able to convert that to common units for the measure of impedance. And I think I have another slide for crime. So for crime, the data tells us the proportion of crime occurring on streets, proportion reported to police, when they occur in terms of times of day. We have average for those. We develop multiplication factors using those. We also have value of property stolen or physical and emotional harm. These come from papers, so they're all established in the literature. And we determine a total value for different types of crime, and therefore determine a value of life years based on that in calculating that impedance measure. So this is where the numbers come from. Now, stepping back, looking at the big picture at a zonal level. So if we have this enhanced accessibility measure at the zonal level, incidentally, we also did something similar for healthcare. So that's why I have the two side by side here. The darker blue is a higher accessibility, and the lighter it goes as you go away from the center, the accessibility gets worse. In other words, you have to travel longer distances to have access to more state schools as you go further away from the center. So this looks like this. There are a few patches here and there, which actually can be quite well explained if you understand the differences across the boroughs in London sociodemographically. Now, this is what I was referring to. On the left, we have a plot of the accessibility measure with air pollutants and crime on the y-axis and without on the x-axis. So without is a more traditional measure, with is the enhanced measure. So if the two were exactly the same, you would be on the diagonal line. But actually, the fact that they're all clustered slightly below is basically telling you that the enhanced accessibility measure brings down the overall accessibility a little bit. Right? So that's the extent to which it's bringing it down. Is it important? Is it not? Something to be debated, of course, but there is a difference. Now, if you start to look at with and without destination quality factor, in other words, an accessibility measure that does not take into account the quality of the destination and one that does, plotted very similarly, if it didn't matter at all, we'd be right on the diagonal. But clearly it matters. But how it matters is a complex picture. There's a lot of noise here. And that's where starting to look at borough by borough differences, differences by income, etc., starts to unpick those differences. We also looked at the financial impact or monetized impact of air quality and crime against the conventional score and against the sort of hand side, it's plotted against a ratio of the enhanced to the conventional score. And so, pardon me, I'll have to come back on this because I can't quite remember what we were doing here. So I will come back on this. I have my notes somewhere. I have the entire paper somewhere. I can take a look at it and come back to you on that. So that brings me to concluding thoughts. So the first thing to note is that when you're analyzing educational accessibility for cities like London, there is a lot of complexity, a lot of assumptions you're having to make because you have the concept of catchment areas for state schools. There are income-based differences in the in the attendance or adoption, if you will, of state versus independent schools. And measuring exposure differences, exposure to crime, exposure to air quality across different travel modes is not trivial. We had to make quite a few assumptions. Having said that, there is a lot of research out there and we had to draw on that research. Nevertheless, they are assumptions. So there's a number of assumptions that are having to be made in building this accessibility measure. As a result, the analysis is illustrative and we need to reconcile the several layers of assumptions that are being made. We seem to be improving the accessibility metric formula in the sense that we're able to unpick a few more differences that are important to be considered when it comes to livability and the design of sustainable policies. But on what basis can we claim that this is an improvement? There is a difference, sure, but we have, in other words, we're justifying at some level the value of accommodating health and well-being considerations into accessibility measures in this empirical context, but on what basis is this accessibility metric or formula one that we can claim can be adopted? We have come up with that impedance metric on a somewhat ad hoc fashion, adding on additional measures of impedance. In other words, we're treating an inability to use poor air quality streets as a reduction in accessibility due to an increase in impedance. But is that the right way to do this? So that still remains a question. So the big thought for me as I conclude this presentation is that having established some empirical justification for looking into these health and well-being considerations when designing accessibility metrics for urban planning, we do need a more theoretical basis on which to build such measures. If we think it's important, if we think that urban and transport planning ought to be using such measures, then it becomes important that we have a strong theoretical basis for developing these further. So with that, I have no idea how long I took, but I'm going to stop. And questions.
Thank you, Aruna. This was perfect. And wonderful presentation, bringing this whole concept of accessibility beyond travel time and cost. And especially, I like the idea of bringing well-being and livability and quality of life related parameters into understanding accessibility. A wonderful way to also influence policy and planning aspects going forward. I mean, couldn't have been a better start for this webinar series than this presentation. Excellent presentation by you. Let's try to see. I can see there are questions already being posted. I'll try to take it one by one. There's one question. Of course, the participant is thanking you for the presentation. If a similar study is to be carried out in India, let us say for New Delhi area or so, what are some of the key challenges that you see in conducting such a study in a different geographical setup like India?
I think the biggest challenge to doing something like this is the data. You've got to be able to pull a variety of different data sources together that are not always available just with the transport planning departments. So in our case, the crime data came from the Metropolitan Police databases, which are actually very accessible. Similarly, air quality data, thankfully, has become increasingly more widely available, so that's not very difficult. So I think the key challenges would be in getting highly disaggregate crime, safety, and air quality data, because you need to be able to distinguish air quality at the road level. So each link in your street needs to be able to have some kind of an air quality measure against it, or air pollutant level against it. And so that might be the biggest challenge. Once you have that and you have it in a GIS platform, the rest of what we did is actually not very difficult. Maybe the challenge then is the theoretical underpinnings, which is what I concluded with. It would be good to have a strong theoretical underpinning for the metric that we're using. At this point, we don't. It's exploratory. But if you want to replicate that exploratory work, the main challenge will be the data.
Thanks. Then there is another question about how do you obtain the weights, that WIJ that you have in your accessibility
That's a very,
equation?
very good question, and very well spotted. Those are ad hoc, right? So, and the way we sort of trialed what would happen with those ad hoc weights is we basically tested sensitivities. We pushed those weights to see how much something might affect the overall accessibility measure, and they do impact the accessibility measure a good bit, so they are important. And obviously the results depend on what those weights are. So what is that weighting? To what extent should we guide access to different quality schools is a difficult question. And perhaps it should be based on the distribution of the quality of schools in the city and the population. And there are ways we can come up with various weights, but and justify them as well. At this point, there is no strong underpinning to that.
Great, thanks. There's another question from Mr. Frank, one of the participants who is also from a simulation software company called In Controls. He is asking if your team used simulation models to get insights in the complexity and the optimal scenarios, maybe
In this instance,
so
no, we
far
didn't
or in
actually.
future.
Yeah, no, so far we haven't actually been optimizing anything. This is purely descriptive. And therefore, we're using a GIS platform to produce descriptive metrics with the data that we have assembled. So no, there was no simulation as such used unless we needed to use simulation uh, in terms of the way the data was used, but certainly not for complexity or optimality. Going forward, if such a measure were to be used for urban planning, I imagine that you would have to somehow produce scenario optimization techniques. I think we're still a good way from that, because we need to first establish a theoretical basis to some of these things. And at that point, I imagine simulation models is the way to go, but we're not there yet.
Okay, great. And there's another question. Did you use linear analysis or network analysis to analyze accessibility with GIS?
It was network analysis. We use the linear distances only to determine catchment areas, and then the rest is network analysis, so path-based.
And there's a question from Shreya, who is asking, how do you translate this to a city-level transport model? You want to?
Yeah, no, this is
I'm not sure. Yeah, what she's
this is an
asking.
interesting point. I think there's a discussion that I've had with my co-authors multiple times about where this metric sits. It's not so much a demand modeling question, it's more an urban planning question. So when a transport for London, or let's say a city that's growing at the moment, let's move away from London to a smaller city that's growing and wants to plan the public transport system for its growing population, typically it will develop accessibility measures in order to determine how various new bus routes or metro routes, etc., can impact the overall accessibility across the city. That sort of planning is where metrics like this are typically used. So city planning, changing bus routes, adding new routes, and to the extent that accessibility measures also feed into travel demand models, they're important, right? And then the question is, should the accessibility measures and travel demand models take into consideration these crime, safety, pollution factors? Now, in travel demand models, we're trying to, what are we trying to do? We're trying to measure how people make choices of mode, etc. At this point, do we actually choose mode by exposure to pollution levels? Some of us do when we're walking. So when I'm walking, especially with my kids, I don't do it for myself, but when I'm walking with my kids, I do avoid roads that have heavy traffic because it's high pollution. But how many people do it consciously or can even afford to do it consciously? So it's not so much a factor that we take into consideration in the choice process. So when it comes to travel demand models, it's not so much something that I think features as yet because it's not part of the choice process. But perhaps it should be part of the choice process. And perhaps, in fact, maybe it shouldn't even be a choice. Perhaps it should be a part of the planning process. That's the argument we're making. So I think it's slightly removed from the demand modeling in that sense.
Great. There's a lot of questions pouring in, and some participants are also typing their questions in the chat. I'll request them to. I'll read those questions as well.
Okay.
But please try putting in the Q&A tab so that I can, it's easy for me to read. Okay. And the next question is, can this new accessibility matrix be sensitive to spatial boundaries and features for a region?
Yes. I think all accessibility metrics are sensitive to spatial boundaries, and they will potentially vary across spatial boundaries. Now, depending on how you measure it. In this instance, we are measuring the accessibility metric at the level of an individual household location and then aggregating it up to the zone. So to the extent that you're aggregating it up to the zone, there will be a spatial impact, but that can be easily tested because you can measure different levels of aggregation quite easily.
There's a question, have you considered any accessibility index or score based on your colored isochrone map? And subsequently, how did you calculate the quality of opportunities?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I'll take the second question first. Quality of opportunities, we didn't calculate. We literally got it from a database that's available with the Department for Education. State schools across London and across the UK are regularly evaluated, assessed, and these scores are available. So we use that. It can change in over time, and as it changes, we can use changing quality measures, or we can use an average over the last 10 years to give us an idea of how good the schools have been, for instance. So there are different kinds of quality measures we can use. The data is available, so we didn't have to calculate that. In terms of an accessibility index, that would be the obvious step if we want to use this measure that we're proposing. At this point, we didn't develop it because, to be very honest, I'm not convinced that the equation that we're using is the equation to use. I think that needs improving. It was something we tried to explore the data to see what it's producing, and it produces interesting results and insights, but I'm not sure that is the one I would recommend for a planning agency. And so we haven't actually translated it to an index or a score, but that would be the next step once we have some confidence in that measure.
And then you can also do some kind of categorization also in terms of good accessibility, bad, and so on.
Absolutely.
So the next question is, did you compare the accessibility measures between the home and school locations and the vicinity with the actual behavior of students, that is the actual school locations that they used in practice?
That's an interesting question. We did not, but we should be able to, because this is the London Travel Demand Survey, so we know where the school locations are. Something that can be done. No, we've not done that though. Yeah, doable.
There's another question by the participants. I'm wondering if you tested these novel measures with city planners or school directors directly, and if this is useful for them to translate into concrete interventions. And he says, we are asked to provide similar assessment of school run here in Zelina in Slovakia.
Yeah.
So I think the participant is from Slovakia. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I'm really excited to hear that you have a need to produce similar assessments, because that also tells us that we're probably heading in the right direction in terms of trying to develop these measures. We haven't actually tested these directly with city planners. This is a presentation that I'm making for the first time, as at least if, I don't know if any of my co-authors are on this call, if you ask them, they will tell you that this is long overdue. So I'm literally making this for the first time, but this is something we would like to be able to share with smaller cities rather than a big city like like the City of London and like Greater London, and see to what extent they might be able to use this. So I like the idea and we'll follow it up, but we haven't done that yet.
Sure, this can open opportunity for you to apply your method or methodology in other geographical context as well. There's a question which asks, is the condition or quality of footpaths for walking being considered in the study?
We did talk about this. We talked about considering street links that have footpaths. We even talked about using walkability, bikeability measures as a means of making certain streets available or not, or weighting them. These are all things we talked about, but I don't think we actually took into consideration in the measure that we presented today.
Okay. There's another question about, the demographic factors, and the participant has asked, while you have used income as one of the factors, did you also consider age, gender, etc.?
Not as much, because we were focused primarily on primary schools and secondary schools. So this was a school education accessibility level. We did look at mixed gender schools, boys only and girls only schools, and we can produce that analysis. But at the state school level, that's fairly mixed across Greater London, so there wasn't too much to see there. And age, we could split up against by primary and secondary schools, and which I think we did, though I haven't presented that in the paper. So not quite. Income seemed to be one of the key factors to focus on, so which is what we did. But this becomes relevant when we look at access to healthcare. Absolutely.
There's another question, I would be interested to know going further how you would link sustainability with accessibility.
Link sustainability with accessibility.
With accessibility, I mean, to my understanding, of course, you have incorporated these factors, especially the exposure to pollution, in your accessibility matrix. So in a way, it basically captures that.
Right.
But I'm not sure beyond that what was expected.
I'm not quite sure what the question means, to be honest. If you could provide a clarification, that would help.
No problem. I think let's move forward. There's another question. Can you please explain how you found or obtained the life year variable while finding PM2.5 and NOx for the accessibility measure?
There is a huge body of literature on the value of life years or WALLYs. So we dipped into this literature to get those numbers and used reasonable estimates for those numbers. So this wasn't something we created. It's from the literature. Again, this is well documented in the paper that we've written, so that'll become available.
There's another question. In considering factors like health impacts or crime exposure for different income levels, did you consider the value a household places on these factors? And he further elaborates, intuitively, low-income households may value factors like health impact lesser than high-income households.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question and perhaps a philosophical question more than anything else. We did not account for the value the household places because our starting point was that these are valuable for all, and the aim of an urban planner should be to reduce health impacts, and improve well-being across the population, no matter income levels. So because we were coming at this from a planning perspective, no, we did not take into consideration the value. Now, the question you're asking would be to analyze, on the other hand, from the demand perspective, to what extent is the ability to value health and well-being a privilege of high-income individuals? That's a different question and definitely a relevant question, but in this case, we did not do that.
That's great. So I think from the Q&A, I have taken all the questions so far. We still have few minutes in case somebody has any more questions, but just out of a few questions from me. So you have considered the accessibility, and correct me if I'm wrong, only with respect to walking and cycling. Did you use public transport also, or measured the accessibility using public transport?
So the numbers I presented to you were walking and cycling in the presentation, but we also did this for public transport. We limited ourselves to walk and cycle and public transport. We did not look at private car use deliberately because this was access to education, and most state schools are accessed by walk, bike, or public transport. But we did look at public transport, yes.
Okay, that's great. That's great. And could you also compare the London results with some other similar studies?
Not yet. I'd love to do that. Not yet.
Yeah, so that you kind of, give some idea about where London stands on these accessibility panels.
That would be nice. And some of the questions that pop up when you think about comparison is whether the schooling system is similar across these cities. Do they have the concept of state schools the way London does? I think we could pick other cities across the UK and compare it for sure. And that might be the best place to start because they're more similar in the educational system. But I'd love to do that.
There's another question I can see.
Yeah, I saw
when
that.
When we aggregate each household sample into zone, then the proportions of sample size would be very small. How can we justify the metric generated? In this case, do we need to capture spatial spillover effects?
Yeah, so to some extent, it actually, the fact that we relied on the London Travel Demand Survey was more for convenience than anything else. We don't have to rely on the London Travel Demand Survey. We could use residential, point-by-point residential locations across the city in the millions as points, origin points, quite easily. Now, the thing with doing that, though, is do we know the income level? We may not know the income level of each household, like each building, but there is enough data that will give us income level of a small community. For instance, you can assess it based on housing value or something like that. And so the metric itself is not limited to being used with the travel demand survey. That was just in this case our choice because we were spending so much time and effort in the other data sets. We wanted to limit the effort put into the household data, and so therefore we use that data. So yes, if we want to apply this on a more widespread scale for real world applications, we'd want to have much larger samples of households. I agree with that.
Just one final question from my side. I mean, it's basically to seek your views. You might have heard about the TomTom Traffic Congestion Index, which kind of rates cities across the world on traffic congestion level. And I think the recent one rated London as the worst traffic congested city, and we are not far behind. Bangalore is at fourth or fifth or something. Yeah, we're catching up with London. But when you look at the methodology, to the best of my understanding, it has a very narrow focus in terms of how much travel time it takes to travel between 2 points, and they try to kind of translate that into some kind of traffic index, and so on. If you were to rethink about how such assessment should be done, maybe based on, this whole idea of accessibility, do you have any suggestions to them in terms of what you've learned and how cities should be ranked? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that unfortunately, yes, I think it would be good to expand the measures they use to look at some of these, but unfortunately, the cities with the highest levels of congestion are also the cities with the highest pollution levels, and are also the cities with the highest risk typically to crime, exposure to crime, road safety, etc., which means it will probably compound all of the effects they're already doing to push it up right to the top even more. You can't catch us anymore kind of place, basically.
I know.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was loudly thinking that, say, for example, if they take different modes and modal infrastructure, and some of these livability and other parameters mode-wise and so on, you might get a different picture.
That is true. That is true.
So
The thing that
maybe
I found, I didn't know this myself until we did this piece of work. The thing I found interesting was that when you look at exposure to pollution, when you're in a bus versus next to a bus versus in a car, there's actually some huge. So, for instance, I had no idea that pollution levels in tube stations, especially underground, was really high. And this is interesting. And until I started doing this piece of work, I didn't realize just how much of a difference there is in terms of exposure depending on the mode you're using. And there's not something we talk about much, partly because I think it sends the wrong signals, partly because the data is not entirely reliable. There are conflicting papers, I think, in terms of that conclusion. They're not entirely sure if those assessments are correct. So lots of different reasons. But yeah, I agree that once we start looking more multimodally, at this point, I'm not really presenting a multimodal picture, even though we've got public transport and walk and cycle. I think if we start looking at this more multimodally, it starts to get interesting. But I also see that, Hemantini, you have a quick question about exposure levels and how they reduce when moving away from traffic. That is exactly what we've done. So when we say that we're taking into account the impact of exposure on accessibility, we're basically penalizing the roads with high traffic more for the level of pollution on those roads, whereas roads that are not the heavy traffic but are the side roads that take you to the nearest school are less penalized because their pollution levels are lower, and therefore they will be part of the route that becomes available for a household to access a school. Except once you start doing this, the routes start to get potentially more winding. In cities like London, very often you find that the lower income people live off of major arterials because housing prices are lower when you're on a major arterial. So to get from a major arterial to a side street to get to school can often be a lot more time consuming. So that penalty increases because you're having to follow longer routes. So that is exactly the kind of thing we did. Yeah.
that's great. That's great. I think this was a wonderful session. Um, um, quite insightful. I think broadening our thought process. and I'm sure this, as a scale further, this could certainly be a wonderful way on how city planners think about the cities and use these measures to plan things better. I think with this note, and yeah, I'm hopeful that some of this work can get into our new
Yes,
journal.
sure.
And yes, likewise to all those who are attending today, you get a sense of what this whole sustainable transport and livability basically constitutes, and we are focusing on. If you have interesting submissions and work that you want to, please feel free to submit to the journal. And as I said, we will continue this web series, the webinar series, roughly every 2 months. So next webinar you can expect sometime in April end or the early part of May, based on the availability of the speaker. But we'll hopefully meet again soon with another wonderful speaker and wonderful presentation within this whole topic of sustainable transport and livability. So with this closing remark and a lot of claps are pouring in, Aruna, for you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for being our opening batsman. And this is a wonderful start. I think you have scored a century already. And
Thank you.
we look forward to a wonderful series going further. Thanks a lot. I think with this, we can close the session. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe there's actually a test match that's starting today, an India-England test match. So,
Let's
so
enjoy
your
that.
analogy is
Let's
very
enjoy that.
appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to all the participants, and stay in touch and hook on to our future webinars in this series.
Thank you all.
Hemantani, you can stop the recording and close the session now. Yeah. Bye-bye, Aruna. Bye. Take care.
Bye.